Okay.
Welcome to Conversations with Tom Shorkey. Conversations explores the past, the present, and the future of the communities in which we live through the eyes of interesting individuals. Now let's join our host, Tom Shorkey.
Welcome to Conversations. I'm Tom Shorkey, your host for the program. Today we're going to cover a topic that's near and dear to most people that have lived their lives in the Blue Water area, and it's something that sometimes we take for granted, but visitors flock to our riverbanks to take a check on our topic. Our topic today is going to be interlake freighters. And since 1958, the people along the St. Clair River have seen a lot of foreign freighters that come in through the St. Lawrence Seaway into the Great Lakes. But up into the early 60s, most every time you looked out at a freighter on the St. Clair River, it was an interlake boat, meaning it was hauling coal, stone, or iron ore from Michigan's Upper Peninsula, either towards Chicago, Gary, Indiana, or down towards River Rouge, Lorain, Ohio, Conneaut, Ohio. With us today is a man who served over 30 years on the Great Lakes. He was a first mate. He was a relief captain on what I believe is the largest boat sailing the Great Lakes today. With us is Marine City resident Mike LaCombe. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
Well, you know, we are going to talk about sailing. We're going to talk about steamboating. We're going to talk about the rivers and the lakes. But first, I always like our audience to kind of get a little feel on who is this person sitting in the chair. So we're going to do a little deep background on you. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Marine City on Bell Street, and we moved there in approximately, I think it was 1949, and went to school for 12 years.
Where did you go to school?
At Holy Cross.
Well, if you lived on Bell Street and you went to Holy Cross, you must have had all of about a 2-block walk to school.
That is correct.
Now in Bell Street, and people that grew up in Marine City, right at the foot of Bell Street on the Bell River is where some of the best hockey outside of Olympia used to get played. Were you one of those participants down there?
I was one of those participants, yeah. I remember as when I first used to go down there skating that it was going down there to play hockey with the big guys, which was quite challenging at times. But that would have been Vic Piper and Billy Miner and some of the local people from right around that street.
Well, I remember that, and I also remember that Bell Avenue or Bell Street, whatever it was called, some of the finer athletes in the early 50s in Marine City grew up on this. Frank and Dick Chartier and Vic Piper, as you mentioned, kind of a legend at Holy Cross back in the day with some others. But so you're a Marine City guy.
Yes, I am.
You went to Holy Cross. You got out of Holy Cross and said, I want to be a sailor.
Not quite that quickly, but right. I had a little stint. My first job out of school was at Quality Feed, working for Harry Author. And after that, I ended up in the car plants for a short while and decided that it wasn't quite what I wanted to do. So in those days, if you wanted to go sailing, you had to have a letter either from a captain or a chief, and that was your character letter to send to Interlake or one of the steamship companies, and then they would provide you with the paperwork to take to the Coast Guard to get your sailing papers. And so that's what I did, and I ended up in 1966 as a deckhand on the Colonel James Pickhands.
Where did you board your first boat?
I boarded that. I got my papers on a Thursday, and I caught that ship on the following Saturday. And Zug Island is extremely hard to find the first time you want to find it.
South in the Detroit River someplace, I think.
It is.
Now, Mike, that was 66. And I think the whole business of lake freighters and sailing has changed so much. But back at that time, And Marine City really was one of these, I don't want to say sailing capital. I mean, back in the 1880s, they built those wooden freighters right along the Bell River where you played hockey. But so many families, their livelihoods were, the dads were sailors. And at that time, when you went sailing, when the ice was out of the river, and we're guessing around St. Patrick's Day, you took your sea bag, you caught your boat, and you didn't come back till it was laid up in December. Is that pretty much how it worked?
That is correct. Yeah.
Well, how did you work your vacation time then?
Well, they didn't have vacations. So you used to have someone that in your family that passed away.
Yeah.
About every 3 years, the same person would pass away to maybe get you a week off the ship. But ironically, Interlake's first ship was built in Marine City.
Really?
It was the Ketchum, and that was built. I don't know if it was McLouse or at Ward's.
Yeah.
But that was their first boat. Yeah.
Well, and growing up in Marine City, and then going sailing, at the time, there were many different lines. I mean, Ford Company had their own boats, the Cleveland Cliffs, the Pittsburgh Steamship line, which has a different name now, but they still have the silver stacks with the black top. There was Canadian, Bethlehem Steel, and you went to work for Interlake, and you stayed with Interlake your entire career?
Not entirely. I ended up in the late 70s. I ended up working for Columbia, and I worked at a very short stint with Ford, and then went back with Interlake in, I believe it was 1981.
Now, for people who don't know, who have only seen these, either the coal or the oar boats or the stone boats go by, when somebody begins a career on the boat, you start in the front end as a deckhand, or you start in the back end as a coal passer or something like. What was your first job, and how many different positions did you have as you worked your way up the?
Well, I had all of them, but I started as a deckhand, and on the forward end, it progresses from deckhand to deck watch to watchman, possibly a bosun, and then a wheelsman, and then your next position would be to write a license, which I did. If you start on the after end, you start as a wiper, and basically a maintenance man in the engine room, and then there's, they used to have firemen, or coal passers, firemen, and oilers, and then you would write your engineer's license, and a lot of them moved up the ladder that way.
So as I remember it, if you went on the forward end of the boat, you started the deckhand, and you could reach the role of captain. If you started on the aft end, and you might have been a wiper to start with, you became third engineer, second engineer, first engineer, and the big job on the back end of the boat was chief engineer.
Chief engineer, that's correct.
Now, that was when there was a front and a back on these boats. Now there isn't. I mean, everything is compiled on, especially these 1,000-footers, on the rear end of the boat. Do they still have a lot of those same designations they had back when you started in '66?
Well, they do. However, a lot of the positions have been sort of like renamed, as far as they did some job classification, reclassification, and they made a lot of the. They still have to carry a captain, 3 mates, and 6 ABs, able-bodied seamen. And they have to have a chief engineer, and I believe it's three other engineers, and then they have to have a qualified engine person. And a lot of it is the titles have been changed to be general purpose, so that basically they can use you wherever they would like to. And that's part of the automation part of sailing. And just as much as there was no self-unloaders when I first started. And that was the robotics, say, of that industry, was putting self-unloaders, the booms, on all those ships.
And prior to that, where they just pulled in, opened the hatches, and those cranes came in and took it out one scoop at a time type of a deal?
And it was a time thing. I mean, you went from depending what you carried, they could do that in 12 hours, and then it became 18 hours, and then 24 hours, and so when you can unload a ship in a smaller ship, say the Jackson, when you could pull up and unload that thing in less than 8 hours, you save a lot of time. And sailing's
save
one
a
of
lot
those
money, or
games
make
that,
a lot of money putting it back.
time is very valuable out there.
Mike, one of the things, I mean, you did how many, 32, 30, how many years actually? I mean, you had a couple off in between in the
Yeah.
slow years, but,
Well, I started in 66 and I retired in 2002.
and the last 9 years or so, you were on the Paul Tregurtha.
That's correct, yep.
And for anybody listening to our show today, the Paul Tregurtha, 1,013 feet long. Is that the biggest boat in the Great Lakes?
1,013.5 feet
Point
long.
5.
She is the queen. She's the largest ship on the Great Lakes.
And in your 9 years there, you worked your way up to the first mate, and then you were also relief captain.
At
When there
times,
was
yeah.
issues with the captain, then you were the man at the helm.
Mm-hmm.
What's the trickiest part about maneuvering a 1,013.5 foot ship through either the locks, St. Mary's River, St. Clair River? I mean, what's the tricky part of that?
When they first came out with the stern enders, probably the hardest, because our perspective used to be at the bow,
Yeah.
in the pilot house. Probably one of the biggest challenges was getting used to the fact that the first water you see in front of a 1,000-footer from the pilot house is 800 feet in front of you.
Wow.
There's a huge blind spot there. And that took a while to get used to that, to know exactly where the bow is, when you're approaching something and you think, to start your turns and so on. And, but they're quite proficient at it now.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
But this is for our watchers at home who maybe have tried to land their 26-foot Sea Ray and thought, gee, that bow is pretty big. 800 feet is a little more to contend with.
Mm-hmm.
St. Mary's River, and I think it was after you retired, I did read an article about the Tregurtha ran aground and then the current took the rear end, and when you get a 1,000-footer, it totally had blocked that whole river across. Did you ever have any experiences where maybe the boat got where it shouldn't have been?
Actually, on that same turn we did, and this was a few years prior to that, quite a few years, but and it was due to the ice. It was in the spring of the year, and ice was starting to move. And going through the St. Mary's River, when there's just the channel, when they break the ice for just the channel, it's pretty much you can manage with that. Basically, with the fast ice on the side of the channel, you can't get out of the channel, so it's a good thing. When those large sheets on the side of the channel start moving, that's what presents a problem. And we were making the turn into the rock cut, and one of those sheets had let loose and stopped us from making the turn. And then when the skipper realized that we weren't going to make this, he tried to stop the ship, and we just didn't stop in time, and we put a hole in her.
What happens when you put a hole in a 1,000-foot freighter?
Well, at that point, we proceeded down to St. Clair, and the Coast Guard came aboard and determined that they could put what they call a temporary patch on it. And so that's what they did, and we were allowed to proceed after that. So.
Well, if you're saying that Tregurtha and coming to St. Clair, I'm going to assume that you were probably hauling coal most of the time then.
That is correct, yeah.
So where did the Tregurtha pick up the coal? Where'd you drop it? And how much coal fits on a 1,000-foot boat?
Well, the coal, if you remember in the 70s when they talked about oil shale, and that's this western coal in Montana and Wyoming. And they rail this in to Superior, Wisconsin. And we load there. And depending on the water levels, we can load, say, 70,000 tons. And we bring that down to Detroit Edison, either St. Clair and or Monroe. And the Bell River Power Plant was built, that's Western coal, so it burns differently than the Eastern coal. It's a softer coal, supposedly more clean burning, but the Bell River Plant was designed for Western coal. So the Togurtha, basically, her main cargo through the year, because she's a little bit deeper than the Minor or the Barker, so she can haul more coal. It's a cubic foot type thing. And so she's mainly the coal boat into Detroit Edison.
Oh, okay. What, if you got the coal coming in there, I read where your boat set some sort of record in 2001 by like shipping over 3 million tons through the Soo locks.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're talking about expanding the locks, but when the Togurtha gets in the lock, and for people that need to know this, Superior is how many feet higher? Do we know?
I believe it's 19 feet.
19 feet higher than Lake Huron or
The
or
St. Mary's River, yeah.
which connects the locks to Lake Huron. When you get your ship in there, how much room is there on either end?
I believe the lock is 1,200 feet.
Oh, okay.
And when you get the ship in there, they lower down a safety boom in back of you and one in front of you while they're changing the water in the lock. The last thing they want is for you to shift ahead for some reason and hit the gate.
Oh, okay.
So they lower those safety booms, and there's approximately 100 feet between those booms and the gates.
Oh, man. All right.
So the lock, I believe, is 1,200 feet.
When you have that much tonnage on a 1,000-foot boat, and the St. Mary's River, as we've talked about, connects like up at the Soo, kind of snakes down with islands in the middle and Drummond Island on one side and whatever. I guess my question would be, is the water level? I mean, some years the lake levels are low. Some years they're high. How does that come into play?
Well, it comes into play quite a bit, actually. As we had the low water years, we had about 11 dry years, and that really affected the water levels, and so that the levels were more wind driven. So depending a lot of times what the wind was doing would either take your water away or you would gain water, depending which way it was. So at the Soo locks, coming down to the Soo locks, the lockmaster very much keeps you informed about which way the water is going. And if there's not going to be enough water, if it's going out where you could possibly ground your vessel, they'll stop you. And below the locks, you have, in the West Nevis Channel, you have the rock cut, where that ship had that mishap, where the Togurtha did. And in that rock cut, sometimes you may have less than 2 feet of water below you.
Wow.
And there's one spot in the St. Clair River that's very tricky too, and that's right off it's about 1,000, maybe 1,500 feet below the Black River. And when you're making that turn, it's a right-hand turn, you have to go very slow because you can have less than 2 feet of water right at that spot. And I think it's the fill, it's what washes out of the Black River.
Oh.
And it kind of, it's almost like a little shoal there. So you have to be very aware of that water depth when you make that turn.
Talk to me a little bit about the technology now that probably wasn't in existence back in late 60s, early 70s, when on a foggy night you had a watchman and a bosun yelling up to the wheelsman and the mate on up in the pilot house. I mean, is that any of that necessary anymore? I mean, is it like, do you put it on GPS and cruise control for a majority of a trip, or how's the technology play out?
Technology is a big part of sailing now that never used to be. We never had to do it that way, but it's all pretty much advantages, and as the electronics became more prevalent out there, basically the ship will take itself across lakes Huron or down Lake Michigan, and at the places where you would make a turn, up Lake Huron, you would have Harbor Beach, and then you would have Thunder Bay Island up by Alpena. Basically, there's a route programmed into your computer, which is also interfaced with your gyro compass, which steers the ship. So the ship will make the turn by itself, and pretty much it's perfected now. When they first put those on, you had to keep you had to make sure that the change that it made is the change that you wanted, and it wasn't always the case.
How about in the rivers, like the St. Clair River? Is that
St. Clair Rivers? I've been away from the industry for a while now, but I believe pretty much that the shipping companies run manually through the rivers, and I know that a watchman is. I don't think it's mandatory as much as it used to be, because a lot of the ships now have a camera mounted up there. But I know that if there's any circumstances that there's going to be close quarters, they'll have a person on the bow.
So if you're on a lake freighter, who's ever the captain, the maid up on the deck, they're kind of in charge of the show. But anytime you would get a foreign freighter coming down the St. Lawrence system, at some point, don't they have to put a pilot on board to get them through these rivers? How's that piece work?
If they don't have the license for the waters they're running, and there has to be an English-speaking pilot aboard.
Okay.
And so there's a few of the saltwater ships that are very frequent visitors, and some of those may have their pilotage. But most of them, they pick up a pilot, and there's different pilotage zones, all the way from the Welland Canal, all the way up to Duluth.
Oh, okay.
And so they pick up a pilot, and they go so far with that pilot, and maybe they make a change at Port Huron. They may make a change at Detour, and then at Duluth.
How's the schedule? We talked and we kind of kidded about it a little bit. When you first, as the old sailors, Marine City used to call it, going steamboating, back when guys went steamboating in the 50s and the 60s and early 70s, you knew when you got on board you weren't coming home till the ice showed up in late November, early December. And a lot of families, I mean, the dad only showed up for 3 or 4 months in the winter. Tell me that little story about you had a neighbor growing up, and when she found out you were sailing, she knocked on your door. What did she tell you?
Well, her name was Margaret Chartier, and of course, her husband was a chief engineer on the boat. So he had to stay late in the season, and he had to go back early, because that's what the chiefs did. And I happened to be passing through Marine City, and Margaret came, knocked on the door, and she was kind of an outspoken woman. She had raised the family because her husband was gone all the time. So, but she said to me, "Are you still sailing?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "I want to tell you something." She said, they called her husband, they called him Conk.
Yeah.
And it was Conk Chartier. She said, "I want to tell you something. Conk retired with 44 years of sailing." And she said, "I saw him. I figured this out, and I saw him 7.5 years out of that time. So you keep that in mind." And down the walk she went.
Well, that's very good advice. But now the schedules have changed from the old you're gone for the whole season. Typically, how does the schedule work now for guys?
Basically, you can work 60 on, 30 off.
Okay, days, 60 days on, 30
60
days
on, 30 days off. And some people work They work exactly that. They get on, when they're on 60 days, they want 30 days off. I opted for a month in the summer, a month in the fall, and then when they made the shipping season, they closed the locks on the 15th of January, and they open them. They open the Soo locks on the 25th of March. So there was 2 months off in the winter. So basically, I would sail 8 months a year.
Tell me about, and this was a tragic time for you because it was somebody you were close to, but tell me about when they knocked on your door when you were the first mate because they couldn't rouse the captain.
Well, the skipper on the Paul Tregurth his name was Mitch Hallen, and Mitch had sailed the boat for quite a while, and they were actually I was second mate at the time on that ship, but they went to call him for the Soo outside of Whitefish Point, and they came knocking on my door and just they said, "My God, you know the captain's on the floor," and so we all headed up there, and Mitch had passed during the night, and so they. Because I had had some experience sailing that ship, they asked me to sail the boat for the rest of the month. So we took it down to the Soo locks, and Mitch was taken off the ship, and then they had me sail the boat for the rest of the month of May, and actually it happened today. It's 14 years since that happened, and so I sailed I sailed it to the end of May, and then June I was scheduled for vacation, so I took my vacation. And 3 weeks into that vacation, they had a ceremony outside of Duluth where they buried him in Lake Superior. He had been cremated, but they had a burial at sea ceremony, and they had his wife and his son and all the company people and the Coast Guard, and after that service.
And they involved the Tregurth in the service also?
Oh, yeah, it was on the ship.
Oh, it was on the
Yeah, they
Tregurth.
anchored the ship outside of Duluth,
Oh.
and they took us all out to the ship, and they had the service on the ship. And so after that, I kind of did some assessing of where I was and decided that I was going to go home and cut the grass. So I retired.
Well, you know, it's interesting between Mrs. Chartier shaking a finger when you lose a friend who's about your age at that time doing the same kind of thing, and that kind of factors into lifetime decisions. Let me ask you this. Who'd you come across in your life that you thought was a positive influence or somebody that...
Well, I've met some quite interesting people in my life. Probably one of the finest people that I met was a fellow from West Virginia. His name was Bill Bosley. And as far as if you've ever had anybody working for you, I've never found a person, you're probably one of the finest people I could ever come up with that as far as to have as an employee. Just an absolutely wonderful man, you know. And he had some Navy experience, but then he came steamboating, and just an absolutely wonderful person, you know. However, he was not a good painter. People wouldn't even want to be. He could put paint on,
Yeah.
but people didn't even want to paint next to him because he would get paint.
But he's a great guy with a great
Well,
work
he
ethic.
could paint. That's one thing I learned out there is that you can't let everybody paint indoors.
I would believe that. Let me ask you this. Any do-over, when you think back of your career and life decisions and whatever, is there anything you'd tweak?
Actually, no. No, sailing was, not everybody can go sailing. It's that type of job to go away like that and do it. Everybody is probably not equipped to do that. And it seemed to work well for me.
Good.
I enjoyed being out there. I really did. I was very, very fortunate to, in all those years, to get a pretty intimate knowledge of the Great Lakes. And it's a pretty fascinating body of water. And to go through the St. Clair River, you have a very interesting perspective on a 1,000-footer because the deck of the pilot house is 75 feet in the air.
Wow.
And I've taken pictures of people's houses for, at different times you go by and the lighting is good. And they ask me, well, what, were you in a plane?
Yeah.
How did you do this?
Yeah.
So it's a great way to see the lakes.
Well, great. Well, we're glad, Mike, that you were with us today. And we're not sure how many nuns at Holy Cross would have bet that you would have been captain in one of the largest boat on the Great Lakes at some point. And we're really glad, as far as cable channel 6, watchctv.org, that you could be with us today. And for our friends at home, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation with Mike LaCombe. And if you know of someone else that would have an interesting perspective on life in the Blue Water area, don't hesitate to contact us at watchctv.org. You can go on our website. There's a little place for contact. If you would like to view this show or any others we've done on Conversations, you go to that website, click the box for shows, scroll down to Conversations, and any of the conversations that we have shown you can enjoy with your own computer at home. But on behalf of Watch CTV, I'd like to thank Mike LaCombe for being our guest today.
You've been watching Conversations with Tom Shorkey. Conversations explores the past, the present, and the future of the communities in which we live through the eyes of interesting individuals. If you have an idea for a future conversation, please contact us at www.watchctv.org. Thanks for watching Conversations with Tom Shorkey.